Tonight, our speaker is Bruen. Bruen has a rich background of experience as a career diplomat and is the former Director of Global Engagement for the White House. As the Director of Global Engagement, he was responsible for public diplomacy programs, international media, crisis communications, and global entrepreneurship programs. He also coordinated the United States' early response to Russian propaganda, developing the first interagency task force to push back against it. Mr. Bruen came to his job in the White House after 12 years of experience as a diplomat representing the United States in countries including Ivory Coast, Liberia, Guinea, Iraq, Venezuela, Argentina, Zambia, and Eritrea. After leaving his position as the White House Director of Global Engagement, he's founded his own firm, which is called the Global Situation Room, and he's the president. The Global Situation Room is a crisis communications firm and a consulting firm. He also teaches as an adjunct at Georgetown University and has been an adjunct faculty member of the Federal Executive Institute, training senior U.S. government officials and leaders on strategy and world affairs. He earned his own degrees with honors in international relations and political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his master's in global history from the London School of Economics and Politics. So, obviously, he brings a very deep and rich understanding of the history and significance of our role on the international stage, having been a part of it. He speaks all over the world. He's spoken at leading universities, including Harvard and UCLA. Last year, he keynoted the Bloomberg Year Ahead Conference in Shanghai and the University College Dublin's Conference on Disinformation, just to name a couple. He is regularly interviewed, and in fact, since he's been here, since yesterday, I don't know how many interviews he's done for television networks, but he's been on CNN International, I think, and Al Jazeera, and he can tell you several. He's a hot commodity, which makes us lucky to have him here. So you know these things are going to be pretty timely, but sometimes you don't know how timely they're going to be. So we're fortunate, we're happy that you're here, and I'd like you all to join me in welcoming him to Marshall University.
So I want to take you into this new world. It's a world, sure, where Donald Trump, in a single tweet, can send markets crashing or rising. But there's also a response. I was in Mexico when, you may recall, at the beginning of the administration, Trump had issued threats. Ford, in this case, actually stopped work on a $1 billion factory in Mexico. And then you saw lots of protests in the streets. Mexicans saying, we're not going to buy American products. Not just cars, but all sorts of American products. And I think here in the United States, it's easy to underestimate the consequence, the collateral damage that comes from some of these actions, not just by the president, by our companies and by organizations as well. We have seen an extraordinary rise in military, in security capabilities, especially from the likes of China. This now changes the equation. We are now no longer the dominant force, especially in a place like the South China Sea. And we will find ourselves increasingly in direct or indirect competition with them. And the Chinese are not just exerting political and security influence. They're exerting economic influence. When they didn't like that anti-aircraft batteries had been put into, or anti-missile batteries had been put into South Korea, they launched a boycott, and that boycott had some serious effects. And then we have my friend Vladimir. He's coming back for version 2.0 of meddling. I loved his comment in Moscow about, joking about the meddling. But he has seen the power of this tool. He has used it effectively on politics. I have news for you, it's going to not stop at politics. It will be used against our companies. It'll be used in social issues. Imagine if the exact same tactics that were so effective against the Democratic National Committee, against Hillary, are now used against Silicon Valley or Wall Street. All of a sudden, you have emails spilling out from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. Some of them not even true. Because the beauty today is it doesn't have to be true. You can fabricate, you don't have to be an intelligence agency, you can fabricate emails, images, video, and it can send markets plunging. We've got, obviously, ISIS on the run, but they have put out a pretty effective playbook of how, through propaganda, you can fill your coffers, you can fill your ranks, you can actually change reality on the ground. You can create a whole state out of pure propaganda. And then, lastly, our friends in Great Britain. In a lot of countries around the world, we're seeing the rise of populism, not just here in the US. And you're seeing politicians who are trying to imitate or to emulate what Donald Trump has done. Bolsonaro in Brazil is a good example of this. Somebody who has seen the effectiveness of those kind of tactics, of those kinds of messages. So this is the world that we're living in. It is a world, and these are just sort of my, Letterman's top 10 list, but these are some of the significant trends that we're noticing. And yet my point is that it was that same commander in Crete who was fond of saying, you can be so focused on the problem that you miss the threat. And I remember sitting at the White House when ISIS came on the scene. And we hadn't really been paying the kind of attention we ought to have to ISIS. I was in Iraq when we started pulling out our troops. And we were focused on other issues in the world, and all of a sudden we found the Yazidis on top of Mount Sinjar. We found ISIS rolling through the streets of Mosul and Tikrit. So I caution that it's very easy to get caught up in whatever the threat of the day is. Iran, North Korea, ISIS. It is what's coming across the horizon that you also have to look out for. And let me tell you a little bit about what's coming across the horizon. So I run an agency now of several former ambassadors. We went out and asked them, 50 former American ambassadors, senior officials in the national security structure, how bad are things? And as you can see, they're pretty bad. Now, mind you, these are ambassadors who have served under Republican presidents, under Democratic presidents. Most of them are career officers. About 20% were political appointees of Republican presidents. It's also bad when we look at our adversaries. This is centuries of experience speaking about where we stand right now, where our adversaries stand right now. This is who they see as having benefited most from the last 2.5 years. And this is where they think the next problem will come from. China, Iran, some other places as well. The Brits aren't doing much better either. I always thank them when I'm over in London for doing this very British thing of throwing themselves into political crisis just to make us feel better. So, at the end of the day, we enter the post-American era. I'm sure many of you saw the title of the speech and said, wow, this is going to be a real downer. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got here. I'm going to tell you about what I think we can do about it, and then I really look forward to a chance to answer your questions, address some of your concerns. So, some of you who have more gray hair than I do, though I every day look in the mirror and I'm shocked by how much new gray hair I have accumulated, will remember that at the height of the Second World War, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt went before a joint session of Congress and he laid out 4 freedoms. And he said, these are 4 fundamental universal freedoms. They are freedoms for which we fight. This was not a moment where the U.S., where our allies were necessarily winning the war. And yet he went at that moment, at that low point in the war, and said, this is why we're fighting. Not just because we have to defeat Nazism, not just because we have to defeat Imperial Japan or Mussolini in Italy. We are fighting for certain values. And we will fight for those values not just for our people, not just for our allies, but for everyone everywhere. And I wrote an article, and this was at the beginning of the Trump administration. It was before he had taken office, but the point was that America's message to the world has gone from that, freedom, to today what essentially could be boiled down to fear. And you go through the Cold War, where we defined our relations with the world through very much realpolitik terms. For those of you who are not in political science, this sort of Machiavellian notion of, we will back people who are against our enemy, no matter whether or not they are like Mobutu in Congo, not very ethical, not very democratic leaders. And then we get to the end of the Cold War. Bill Clinton takes office, and some of you will remember that the situation in the former Yugoslav Republic was not good. There were civilians being slaughtered in Kosovo. Bill Clinton rallied the world. He rallied NATO at the time because he could not get the United Nations, he could not get a broader coalition together. And he said, we are going to protect these people, but we're only going to protect them from 10,000 feet because we're not putting boots on the ground. We had been through the shock. Some of you may have seen the movie Black Hawk Down. We had lost troops in Somalia. We hadn't acted in the Rwandan genocide. And this was sort of the new vision of, well, yeah, we'll engage, but we're not going to really put boots on the ground. And then 9/11 came along. I remember one of the reasons that I became a Foreign Service officer was I was an intern at the United Nations in New York the summer of 2001. We used to go to Windows on the World every Wednesday. And then I went back to Madison, Wisconsin to finish my last semester of school. A couple weeks later, I woke up and 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning probably. I didn't wake up that early in college, maybe like some of you. And all of a sudden on the television, you see plumes of smoke coming out of 2 World Trade Center. And it was interesting because that summer seems like such a different time. I remember the idealism. It was something that drove me into international affairs, was hanging around young people from France and from Belgium, from China and Japan. And it was during that summer that I had signed up for the Foreign Service exam, but it took on different meaning after 9/11. And I went out and took the exam, and I took it because I wanted to be able to put the world back together. But the reality is, during those years after 9/11, our message to the world, the lens through which we looked at the world, was one of fear. We defined our engagement with countries strictly based on terms of security, on terms of terrorism. And then you get up to the president that I served under. First, on that base out in Iraq. Later, I served in the White House. I was commenting to Patricia earlier today that I took the really long paths to the White House because I was out on an island unto myself in Madagascar doing my own thing and had no expectation of coming back to Washington, let alone to the White House. But Barack Obama had many fine qualities. He didn't, however, have that same notion of universal values for which the United States should engage in the air, should engage on the ground. I remember the conversation we had when the Yazidis were up on top of Mount Sinjar, and we just couldn't let them be slaughtered, so we engaged. And then we put troops down into Kurdistan because we had a consulate in Erbil, and we had to protect that consulate. And President Obama gives an evening address to the nation where he says, well, I'll help people, I'll help civilians if they can escape from ISIS. And you contrast Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying, we will go anywhere, we will help anyone, to, we'll help you if you can escape. So my point is, even though it's easy to look at someone who worked for President Obama and say, yeah, of course, he's going to talk about the post-American era because Donald Trump's in office, it started long before. Now, Donald Trump kind of, kicked the can over the side into the ravine, and then may have kicked it farther down. But this didn't begin with Trump. It has been a long time in coming. And it has some rather serious consequences that I think we're only starting to appreciate. First, you have security consequences. Look at the world today. I went through some of the big issues, but let's take some of the smaller ones. You've heard of Jamal Khashoggi, just celebrated or mourned a year since his passing. Now that was a rather remarkable incident, that Saudi Arabia, this close American ally, would be so bold as to not only kill someone, you can kill them on the street, as one of my former CIA friends told me. You can kill them when they're sleeping. But to kill them in your consulate sends a message, very clear message. And you only do that if the old rules no longer apply. And then you take, for instance, the spat that Saudi Arabia had with Canada. Christina Freeland, the foreign minister of Canada, came out with some mild criticism on social media of the human rights record. It's stuff that Saudi Arabia had heard before. But Saudi Arabia reacted with a torrent of actions. They canceled trade with Canada, cut it off, canceled flights. This is the post-American era, in which the old values, the old traditions no longer apply. And so the United States, and I'll use an example from just this morning. Some of you may have followed the news. The President of the United States comes out on the South Lawn of the White House and says, I welcome not only Ukraine, but China. Come on down, help us out. Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, we got to look into them. Well, that behavior is modeled around the world. Imagine if Bolsonaro in Brazil says, you know what, China, it'd be really helpful if you could, in the next election, help dig up some dirt on my opponent. I spent most of my time, my diplomatic career, in Africa. Many African leaders would love that. That's great. We can continue to have elections and China will just dig up dirt on everyone and we can stay in power and we're good. There are very serious security consequences to that. There are also serious security consequences to what we are seeing with the actions that China, Russia, other countries are taking when it comes to borders. Borders are disappearing. We started out in the Ukraine. Well, Russia decided Crimea, it should be ours again, so we'll take it back. What is China doing across the South China Sea? They're just unilaterally picking off islands. They're building islands out of the ocean. This is the post-American era. These are the security consequences. Now let's get into the economic consequences. You see how difficult it has been to negotiate for this administration new trade deals? It's easy to tear them up. It's easy to bulldoze over the past. It's really hard to put them back together. It's also hard to put them back together. And this is where my concept, where I first wrote about the post-American era, when we tear up a deal like what we signed with Tehran, and then we go out to North Korea and we say, but make some serious compromises. Really? We'll honor them. It's harder for them to believe you. If you've shown that you're not willing to honor the last deal, take, for instance, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the one deal that Trump has negotiated. And then what does Trump do? He turns around and goes back to Mexico and said, well, you know what? I'm going to add some more tariffs if you don't cooperate with me on this other issue. So we're now entering a world in which it is going to become much more difficult to secure those kind of real compromises, to get to those real deals. People simply don't have faith any longer that our word is our bond, whether it's this president or others. We also have political consequences. We just don't have influence anymore in the world. And I don't mean this just in a theoretical sense. Look at what's happening at the United Nations. The United States backed El Salvador for the UN Security Council. This is an election where all the countries, all 200 countries in the world, have an opportunity to vote. El Salvador, with US support, got 5 votes. I worked on an election, our firm worked on an election in the spring. We had US support. It was the government, it was the candidate from Georgia, the country, running to lead the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. We got 12 votes. We did a little bit better. This is the state of American influence right now in the world. We are not persuading anyone. Yes, we can bully. Yes, we can send, threats via tweets. But what happens when we need those countries, when we need those leaders to help us? Whether it's on immigration, whether it's on security matters, whether it's on investigations, not just into Joe Biden, but investigations into criminal groups or terrorism. That cooperation is going to be a lot harder in coming. So I'd like to switch lastly to the changing nature of diplomacy and what we can do in a post-American era. So the Peace of Westphalia, 1638, this is what set up the international order, where things like diplomatic immunity, everybody's familiar with diplomatic immunity, I enjoyed it for several years, were first written down and enshrined into international law. And the idea was, in order for countries to have relations, you had to have certain rules, and those countries would essentially govern everything because they were the voice of their people. That's no longer the case. You now have a situation in which one citizen can speak up and be heard around the world. One video captured on a cell phone can help to topple governments, can help to bring new leaders to power, can help to raise the consciousness of the world. So my point is this: you, all of you, young, old, have an enormous power today. We may be entering a post-American era where our government plays less of an influential role on the world stage. But we, as citizens, can play a more significant role in the world. We can lead campaigns, we can lead movements. You have the example of Greta Thunberg from Sweden, 16-year-old, who has perhaps done more than anyone in the modern era to advance the debate on climate change. How many of you could lead a movement, could just lead a conversation? You know, so often I think it's easy in the United States, and I say this having spent much of my adult life overseas, looking at our world through the community, through our country, less what lies beyond. But the reality of the post-American world is we have to. We no longer will have the luxury of assuming everybody's going to play by the same rules, of assuming that the United States of America will simply be able to protect, to promote, to preserve the way of life that we have enjoyed for so long. So we do have to look beyond where perhaps we were considering and engaging before. There's another important point, and that is companies. We've seen here in the U.S. how companies are playing more and more of a significant role in public debates. Questions about gun rights, questions about immigration, questions about all sorts of other social issues. All of a sudden, Walmart, Target, Delta Airlines have to have policy positions, and those policy positions move markets. They move leaders. This is part of a new world order in which, and I wrote a piece about this a couple years ago, where the CEO, and my former media outlet US News did a survey that showed that CEOs like Jack Ma, who runs Alibaba, Jeff Bezos, have more influence than most heads of state. So when they say something, when I was over, in China several times, when Jeff Bezos says, I want companies, I want countries to follow this practice, they listen. May not all do it, but he certainly has influence. And then lastly, the last group of folks that have to change are the countries themselves. So the U.S. will no longer be the dominant force on the world stage. We will still be strong, don't get me wrong. We'll still have lots of weapons. We'll still have lots of money. And we can throw it around to some effect. But we are going to need alliances. We're going to need the European Union. We're going to need the likes of the United Kingdom in whatever form it chooses to engage, whether it's within the European Union or outside. We're going to need Japan. We're going to need Australia. We're going to need other like-minded countries to lend their voices. We are going to have to engage. We're going to have to find mutual interest, and we are going to have to do things together. They also are going, and they are currently, actively engaged in this process of a Plan B. They can no longer depend on the United States of America to take the lead on many of these issues. So what do you see? You see the likes of Emmanuel Macron in France going out and taking the lead on issues and trying to rally the world behind him. whether it's climate change, women's rights, aid for Africa. These were issues that for so long we, the United States, were leading on. But we've ceded that ground. And I think you will see it more and more where other countries, to good and to ill, will lead. We will see leadership from Russia. We will see leadership from China. We will even see leadership from smaller countries like Saudi Arabia that are going to try to throw their weight around to see if, well, in this new world order, can perhaps I get away with it? Maybe the U.S. won't come down on me. Maybe the other countries won't be able to come down on me so hard. So my point is, whether you are a citizen, whether you're a company and an organization, or whether you are a country, in the post-American era, your role is greater. I think one of the features of this post-World War II, post-Cold War period was we got to enjoy taking certain things for granted. We got to take for granted that our government was always going to be there to open doors for us, to protect us, to move the world towards a better, a brighter place. That's no longer something that we can take for granted, and all of us need to take up the cause. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions, and I welcome questions, criticisms, concerns. Sir. So the question, for those who didn't hear it, was how do you counter propaganda that may be domestic? I'll expand it to be whether it's right-wing, left-wing propaganda, but propaganda. And the truth of the matter is I specialized for a dozen years in helping us overseas as a country to shape debates and conversations with different tools that we have. And you know, for a long time, we as a country, and I think even we as citizens, took for granted that certain values, certain norms were just given. And I don't think we can do that, whether it's on the world stage or here in our own country. Take for granted any longer that we have to stand up, we have to do as good a job, as active a job, as aggressive a job, defending certain values, certain facts, rather than just assuming, well, you know, everybody is going to love democracy. Everybody's going to love human rights. Everyone is going to love freedom of speech. And now we, you know, live in a world in which those fundamental freedoms are suddenly drawn into question. So one of the things that I caution against, and we can have a whole long discussion about this, but in those early days, looking at this new version of Russian propaganda, what I saw was Putin would say the sky is purple. We would say it's not. We're still having a conversation in the context that he wants us to have that conversation. Similarly, ISIS. And then the U.S. was going to roll out with our anti-ISIS, countering ISIS propaganda. Well, you know what? We are still on their terms. And I think similarly here in the U.S., too often the debate that we're having is on those negative terms, is on that defensive position, and not trying to move the debate over here. And how do we do that? Well, this is part of what I'm saying is we've got to be much more affirmative and proactive about saying, this is the real conversation. This is where we think our public debate needs to be. And so less time focused on just trying to disprove disinformation, less time spent trying to, you know, counter some of those arguments, and more time on a constructive conversation that is hopefully going to carry the day. We can have a long conversation about that. Yes, sir. You know, I will say this. I was not one of the former Obama officials that came out and said, "Not my president." Because that was exactly what certain members of the other party said when Obama was elected. And I think we have to get to a place in our country, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican president, where we can disagree, we can fundamentally disagree with who they are, with what they do, but we can still respect the office. We can still respect their right to be the elected leader. They were elected. I mean, that, you know, at the end of the day, I think we have to recognize in this country. I do believe, though, that there are certain actions that raise very serious questions about suitability, about the security of our country. And I think we are there, that we need to have a serious, not a partisan investigation. I genuinely hope that we can pursue an investigation, and I would caution some of the Democrats about coming out and being too aggressive in pursuing an investigation, an end to that investigation, rather than having a real transparent, trusted process that we go through that ultimately gets us to a decision. And I don't know that there are many people in Washington right now that believe that Donald Trump will be removed from office. But I do think that we can restore some modicum of faith in our institutions. I do think it's important that we have these debates, that we have these investigations. So let's focus on that. Let's focus on, you know, how do we restore trust in the presidency? And I will also say, and this is a point that I find myself largely in agreement with the White House on, I don't think we should all of a sudden start making these conversations between world leaders public. There are important discussions, candid discussions that they need to have, and that needs to be done in confidence. We need to deliver hard messages, we need to hear hard messages, and there's a reason why those conversations have always been kept under lock and key. Yes. Yeah, and the question is, really, I think, to the incident with Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, you know, it was Saudi Arabia who killed him, took place in Turkey. Why is this something that we should, here in the U.S., be concerned with? And the reason, I believe, is there is a very dangerous precedent and a very slippery slope that we start going down. If all of a sudden we allow countries to knock off their journalists, to knock off their critics, and to face no consequences. Because the next one, and this is a point I've made, some of you perhaps have followed what's taken place with the chief financial officer at Huawei, the Chinese cell phone company. So the U.S. issued an arrest warrant for this woman. She landed in Vancouver, and she was apprehended. And she still is in Canada in trial. My concern is that's going to happen to our executives when we go over to China. Having been there on business trips, believe me, it crossed my mind. Canadians have actually had several of their executives arrested on trumped-up charges in China. Similarly, and there were incidents of Russian intelligence officers that the U.S. Captured when they were traveling to places like the Maldives. And yeah, we can do it, but they're also going to do it to us. So this concept in diplomacy of reciprocity, and it's not just reciprocity of like trade tariffs, but it's reciprocity of action. If Donald Trump says, China, steal some secrets for me against Joe Biden, then other countries are going to do it too. And if we let Saudi Arabia take that action, it does have consequences, not only for other journalists in the Middle East, but I think for journalists, activists, leaders. And so I would say it does matter to us. And this is, I think, also the broader point that I'm making about the realities of this post-American world. If we all of a sudden allow for countries to engage in that kind of action, and we aren't going to stop because we are taking more of a Trumpian view of, well, you know, Saudi Arabia helps us out in a lot of other stuff, so we'll give them a pass on, you know, this one journalist. Right, and my point to that would be, yes, you're right. It was involving a Saudi citizen. He's also an American resident, but I mean, I will just address your point because it could well be that it was the next time somebody who had no connection to the U.S. And I still think that it is a very dangerous precedent for what then happens if we allow that kind of action. If we allow any country to extrajudicially kill citizens, kill critics, kill journalists, you're opening the floodgates for that kind of behavior to take place anywhere in the world and to anyone. And that's why, again, the broader point that I'm making, I'll be with you in just a second. The broader point I'm making is that in this post-American era, where those rules are no longer quite as firm, we will find ourselves in not just situations where one journalist in one country is executed, but a whole series of journalists, of critics, and that has a chilling effect on dissent. It has a chilling effect on democracy. In those countries, in other countries where perhaps journalists have difficult relations, even more difficult than our journalists do with the government. So it is concerning to me, and I would argue that we have not just a moral obligation. I'm not making purely a moral case. I think it's a security, and it is a national security imperative for the U.S. if we don't act forcefully when those things happen. Yes, sir. So the question is this concept of world order, and one that has largely been based on military power, largely formed, you know, the U.S. has such an outsized expenditure on military issues, and why does that might make right in that context, if I'm getting your question correctly. So what I think we're seeing in the world today is a pretty radical upending of that world order. So, you know, in some ways, it is getting exactly to your concern about how this world order was constructed. Because the U.S. can have these massive weapons. We can spend more money than the next 16 countries combined. But we can also find ourselves, and this is a point that I've made again and again and again, that while the Russians didn't launch a missile over to the U.S., the destruction caused by their information operations was actually far greater, I would argue, than an intercontinental ballistic missile landing in the U.S. Our institutions, our confidence in the democracy was so badly shaken. And so what we're seeing is that traditional concept of world order that was based on you have these weapons, you have this money, you have power. Well, now power is much more diffuse. And I think we will see a reordering of it. And my belief is that it's going to recongeal into spheres of power. and that those spheres of power, the U.S. will continue to be an important sphere, but we will not be as dominant as we were before. And that other countries will form, it's almost a little bit like Game of Thrones, I guess, in that, we'll have the different kingdoms or spheres of influence, and there will be friction between them. There will be norms that will be established within certain spheres, and outside of those spheres, those same norms won't necessarily apply. So it is a brave new world. And as you probably can tell, I am certainly lamenting the loss of the world order. It was a... Yeah. No, it's a valid question. What I am arguing is that the post-World War II American era was a period in which there were strengthening of certain norms, there was stability, there was progress, and that is what we are losing. And there are other criticisms that you can make that are valid and that we can spend over long conversations time deconstructing. But what I would generally argue is that the world in which we are about to embark upon is vastly different than the world that many of us grew up in. And that is going to there are going to be positive consequences to it. I'm not dismissing that, but there are also going to be a whole lot of other negative consequences. Yes, ma'am. I'm glad you asked that question because I neglected to make a key point, which is that just because in November of 2020, a Democrat wins the presidency, we don't necessarily revert back to where we were. And I say this partially based on the fact that if you look at what happened after George W. Bush's presidency, sure, there was an upswing, and lots of countries all of a sudden became very pro-American, favorable, but we didn't go back to where we were. We didn't go back to, people didn't forget about Abu Ghraib. They didn't forget about Guantanamo. They didn't forget about some of the serious issues that we had in Iraq, nor will they forget about this period. And that's what so concerned me about us throwing the Iran deal into the dustbin. It's what concerns me about some of these actions like today's where we are just absolutely plowing off of the highway and into a deep ravine, and we don't necessarily just pop back up. What I will say is this, that Obama's worldview was very much predicated on this idea that America can't do everything. We are not the policemen of the world. We have to recognize our limits. But at the same time, he, I think, failed in several respects. I mentioned Iraq. We also had Syria. There was a humanitarian disaster unlike many of us have seen in the world, and we failed to act. And it was largely based on that same ideology, that same campaign promise that was made by candidate Obama, that we're going to get out of Iraq, we're going to get out of these foreign entanglements, sound familiar, and bring the troops home. So we didn't go back into Syria, and millions of Syrians died. And now I'm listening to Democratic candidates, and if you can't tell, I'm not really backing anybody right now. And I'm listening to the Democratic candidates, and they're saying, well, we'll pull out of Afghanistan within a year. Based on what? I mean, I saw that firsthand and how poorly that went and how that helped to lead to the rise of the Islamic State. So, making a promise like that without knowing where we will be 2 years from now, what the conditions on the ground will be, I worry that we do get ourselves back into some of those ditches. And I just generally am concerned that those statistics about America's international influence, about the strength of our adversaries, they aren't recoverable. Because confidence, and if you haven't, I would suggest there's a piece I wrote in my last column on this, and I end it by saying that this credibility, our leadership and influence, that takes decades to recover. It's not flipping a switch. It's a pattern of behavior over a long period of time that people, leaders, begin to trust. And we're not, just because, whether it's Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, people aren't just going to say, oh, great, well, Bernie's in there, so we're now going to go back to putting our full faith and confidence in the White House, in the United States. Not going to happen like that. Yes, sir. So the question is, if the world is moving towards these spheres of influence, will one of them be a sphere in which those countries that want more homogeneity in their country, anti-immigration, perhaps some of those progressive policies? I think it is a probability, and that what you're seeing happening is these leaders, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, Duterte in the Philippines, who play off of one another. And it creates this, well, he did it, so now it's created the precedent for me to do it. And if you want a good example, it's a vastly different one. But, as was mentioned, I served in Venezuela. I was there actually under Hugo Chavez. And Chavez built a sphere of influence. It was a pretty powerful one. And he used his oil money to drive it. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see those kinds of spheres pop up. As to who's going to lead it, open question. Certainly at this stage, if Donald Trump is reelected, we may well be one of the leading countries in that sphere. You see the sort of Brazil, U.S., U.K., and others. So it is absolutely a real concern. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's so important for these other actors, and I don't know how we are on time, so please feel free to give me the signal and drag me off. But I come back to this, closing argument that I made, which is, if we want to push back against that, look at what's happened even in our own country. When states have taken certain action, whether it's to restrict a woman's right to choose or against LGBTQ rights, what has been the most influential factor? Companies. Companies saying, I'm not going to invest there, or I'm going to pull my investment out. So this is where, when I'm making this case that companies and citizens and organizations and other countries have to step up, that's a pretty good illustration of what I mean.